College football nerds here doing something a little different because the lineup this week is absolutely dreadful. Yes, we are going to cover the Michigan-Ohio State game, but mostly to talk about Ohio State in the playoffs, and that's the only preview we're doing this week. We are a day late, but we get them in either way. We are talking Mac Jones and Tua in this one, and I've got Josh with me. We're going to get nerdy. I've also got my sidekick right here. No sponsorship or anything. I just love the beer. It's Ghost and Machine from Parrish. It's really good. If they got distribution in your area, you should definitely check them out. Somebody pointed out the trim tab I was drinking last week, so I wanted to see if there's anybody else in there that likes good beer. All right, Josh. This is an interesting topic that keeps coming up, and we debated whether or not we would do a couple of other videos. One was Mac Jones versus Kyle Trask. We might still do that, but we're trying to do something a little less combative and contentious. And then the other one was, Devontae Smith, Kyle Pitts are the real Heisman contenders, which I think we both think that's the case. But let's just focus on quarterbacks for a minute. And Alabama fans and the nation, they're all familiar with Tua Tagovailoa. And Mac Jones kind of came out of nowhere. He's putting up Joe Burrow-like numbers with a tougher slate. So you don't have the garbage time games baked in where you can throw it all over the yard, I guess, unless you play LSU. We're not a mixed company, so I can say that. But Josh, I want you to talk a little bit, just to get us going, about not necessarily Mac versus Tua yet, but kind of give us a primer on Tua and the offenses, because he's had 3 different coordinators when he was at Alabama. The offenses he ran and maybe the limitations or where they were good, and just kind of get us into this discussion.
The story to me with Tua Tagovailoa is that he came in, obviously as a freshman, took over the championship game, and then in 2018, they kind of had a decision to make. Were they going to start Jalen Hurts or were they going to start Tua? And I think something a lot of people forget is that Tua was not the starter game 1 in 2018. And Jalen Hurts was the starter. They never really, I think, identified what the offense was going to be, and I think it hurt them that year. Their offense to start the season was really good, but it was really good against poor competition, and it was a little bit of a one-trick pony. It was RPO based. Loxley really loves to slant RPO throw with a running game underneath. But something kind of happened in the middle of the year in 2018. One, Tua got banged up, and you could really see that affect his numbers. LSU and Mississippi State were a particular note. There's a lot of things I'll say as an aside where people will point to those 2 games as indications that Tua couldn't play when hurt. I think that's a little bit of fool's gold because in the Auburn game, which was a similarly ranked defense to LSU, I think maybe slightly higher that year, puts up 52 points at 10 yards per attempt, 5 touchdowns, no interceptions. So I don't think that narrative is quite so cut and dry. I think the bigger deal is that the offensive scheme was a little simplistic, really. And that RPO is hard to defend, but the teams that could really defend the run well, they were able to stop Alabama because they would rush 4, draw back in coverage, and it wasn't just taking away the hero throw, it was really taking away those RPO slants. And this whole RPO game Alabama was trying to run kind of got turned into a predictable mess. The biggest example of that to me was in the Clemson game. Now, Clemson in 2018, if you followed us for a long time, I had been tracking how that defensive line might have been the greatest defensive line in the history of college football. No joke. I mean, I think every one of those guys went first or second round in the draft. And the fact that you have 3 first-rounders in the same line, you can go back and look at a whole bunch of other teams. Pretty much unprecedented. There have been plenty of good guys. If you're an Alabama fan, you think, well, we've had great lines. How many of those really good linemen didn't actually get drafted in the first round? How many of them slipped just a little bit into the second round? That didn't happen with Clemson. Those guys went very high in the draft. And even guys, like an edge rusher that you didn't think were so good, they ended up going high themselves. But anyway, long story short, 2018 Clemson, they knew they could more or less handle the run game with 4. And they let Alabama run the ball between the 20s and said, we're going to drop 7 guys and we're going to defend the run with 4. Alabama got, 5 yards of carry. They ran the ball well, a lot better than anybody had that year. But they didn't get explosive plays because there was always somebody back there to make the tackle. And I will say, you know this theory is a little bit right because you don't see many explosive plays from Najee the past couple of years. Why is Najee Harris not breaking away long runs? It's because teams started dropping their safeties and their linebackers back, so he gets through the line of scrimmage, and then there's 3 or 4 guys back there to make the tackle 6 or 7 yards downfield. Makes it really hard for him to have an explosive play. It also makes it hard for Alabama to score in big chunks. So in that Clemson game, and I think Mississippi State had a similar strategy, they kind of slowly worked down the field. I think Loxley got a little bit impatient. And then when they got in the red zone and got compressed, the scheme didn't work. You can't run the RPO because the safety doesn't need to really key run pass. He can run up to defend the run, and he won't get burned over the top because there's not enough space. The linebackers can play you straight, and it all kind of neutralized. And I'll say, that theory to me has been proven true with Talia because there have only been 4 games, but Tua Tagovailoa is running Loxley's scheme, and it's basically the same offense they ran at Alabama. And in 4 games this year, Talia has averaged 8.3 yards per attempt, a good total, but he's varied from 3.8 yards per attempt against Northwestern to 11.3 yards per attempt the very next week against Minnesota and been anywhere in between. Totally boom or bust. And I think that's the story. Either that RPO scheme works or it doesn't. And I will say for my part, I think a lot of Tua's problems would have gone away if he'd simply had Sarkisian the whole way. And he would have looked a lot more like the quarterback we saw dazzling people under Daboll's scheme in one game in the national championship.
Yeah, I do think, and we've said this before, that Daboll, if he'd stayed with Alabama, they actually might have had a shot in 2018. We were critical of the offense that Alabama ran in 2018, but we saw some of this, and this is where I'll give you a little counterpoint, and where I'll first introduce where I think Mac Jones is better than Tua. We saw this with Tua at Alabama the next year, partially why he got hurt. And the criticism of him has I think always been fairly true, not the injury situation, because if you remember, if everybody out there remembers, the 2 ankles were just ankle sprains. They just wanted to get him back faster than normal, so he had surgery because they had crap games in between. So the injury thing I don't really care about. But why was he injured? Why was he getting rolled up on? Why did he hurt his hip? He was always looking for the hero throw. And I don't know if he was conditioned to do that because under Loxley it was RPO slant, and then over the top. Or if it's just who he is because he is so physically gifted that he thinks he can always hit that shot. Mac Jones does a lot better in taking what the defense gives him. Tua made that great medium range throw, but a lot of times it was a one read throw. It wasn't a third progression, 14-yard, 9-yard pass. It was, I threw a beautiful ball on a deep out, 14 yards down the field, because that was my first read. Mac Jones, on the other hand, might have a deep read, and we saw this against LSU Saturday where they took it away, and he found that intermediate throw that kept the chains moving. So he has had a lot of deep bombs this year. Some of that's because of trash defense, but he does seem to have the ability to keep the ball moving up the field. And I think that's an area where he is better than Tua. And it might stop there. But do you at least agree with me on that one?
I do agree. And there are a few things there. One is I think he uses the tight end better than Tua did. He's willing to check it down there a lot. He's willing to check it down to a back. I will say he was better at that early in the year. And I think going to the conditioning aspect, the past few games, I feel like he has been pressing a little bit. And he hasn't checked it down as much. And I think because he got so used to hitting bombs. But one little quirk that I think is very telling is how willing Mac Jones is to just ground the ball at somebody's feet on a screenplay. Have you noticed that? Like, if Alabama has a screen that is not going well, Mac is very quick to just say, you know what, fine, and just spike it, even if it's on 3rd down. And I don't really ever recall Tua doing that. He'd try to run it out, if nothing else, and scramble for a 1st down, but didn't have an immediate willingness to try to ground those plays.
The other area that I think, and this might be where it does end, but I think this is a pretty clear win for Mac Jones because I think he's probably the best in the country at it right now. Mac Jones climbs the pocket, and he did this last year. It's a natural thing for him. He climbs the pocket better than I think anybody that I've seen in years. Joe Burrow did a really good job with this too, so I put him in that category. Mac Jones is not mobile, and maybe this is really not a better, it's just different. Tua could extend a play a lot like Ian Book does at Notre Dame, where if the pocket breaks down, he finds a way to slip out, roll to the outside, and hit somebody on a rollout. Mac Jones climbs the pocket vertically. He has this little hop that he does, and he keeps his eyes upfield. And I think that in the NFL is actually a more coveted skill than being able to wiggle out of, because a lot of times you got to turn your back to the field to do that, to wiggle out of pressure. I do think that's the other area again, it may end there, but for me is a clear area where he's better than Tua. What do you think?
I do agree with that. And I do think, though, a lot of that may be due to height, right? We both would acknowledge that Mac Jones is taller than Tua, probably 2 to 3 inches taller. Tua is lucky to be 6 foot. That doesn't mean that he's a bad quarterback by any means, but it changes the way you use him. Russell Wilson doesn't stand tall in the pocket a lot either. And the truth of the matter is he's just not tall enough. And there are throwing windows. And when you're at that height, you've got to release kind of between linemen, right? You've got to release through a gap. It is hard to throw over someone unless you're really throwing down the field. And visibility is also impacted. So Tua likes to use his mobility and get him out wide. Jones is more in the pocket. I do agree with you from an NFL perspective. There's some advantage to Jones's style because while Tua's athleticism is great, and you've seen it with some guys, he's not a Kyler Murray. He's not gonna pull a Lamar and run for 15 yards or outrun a DN. He's fast enough to stay agile and really quick in the pocket. I think is something people miss a lot. Maybe not necessarily fast, but he's really, really quick and good at evading immediate pressure. But he's not going to outrun a DN. And that's the whole problem in the NFL is that you have to be really, really fast or you're going to get run down. And I think that's where Jones has an advantage. I will say, too, that the height comparison I find to be interesting because I do think people underestimate Jones's size a little bit. And he was a scrawny guy earlier in his career, but 6'2", 6'3", about 205. He's almost exactly the same size as Zach Wilson at BYU, about the same speed. Supposedly he's within a tenth of a second in the 40. They're both about 4'8" guys, though Zach's maybe a shade under and Mac is a shade over. But there's been a lot of hype with Zach Wilson, and I think he's sort of viewed as a more dual threat guy because of how BYU uses him. But BYU uses him. That's kind of funny. But the reality for Mac is I think he is a pretty good athlete, and he has pretty good size, more so than people give him credit for, and enough size to kind of fit the NFL mold. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I like that size and his ability to throw the ball away has led to him being more durable than Tua because he's not taking those hits. But in Tua's defense, I think Mac Jones has a better offensive line than Tua. Not necessarily different players, just better players as a unit in their second year under Sark's scheme. They look more comfortable, and Alabama is a much better run team. Najee Harris is better this year, so I think Tua didn't have the same tools or the same opportunity. This is kind of a perfect storm for Mac Jones to look good. Now, I don't agree with the people that are saying that it's all the talent around him. Yes, Smith is great. He lost Waddle, who might be, if not the best wide receiver in the country, the most explosive, take the top off the defense guy in the country, which did limit, Waddle to Mechie, while Mechie is good, is not the same thing. So the fact that he has not skipped a beat with just having Smith, who can be bracketed, maybe he can't, I think is a testament to him. On the flip side, something for Tua that I want you to talk about a little bit is just the physical makeup of him in terms of what makes him special and where he might have an advantage over Mac Jones, either be it release time or the throws he makes. Just get into that a little bit, and let's at least make a case for Tua before we come to a decision.
I think the thing that really separates Tua from a lot of guys is his quick release and arm velocity with speed. And what I'm trying to say with that is that basically Tua can flip his hips, get the ball out, and throw it on a rope. And I don't know that I've, in recent memory, seen a quarterback that was as accurate as he is on a lot of slant plays and those quick 5 to 20 yard plays where the ball hits his hands, he's got it up and he's got it out and to the target exceptionally quickly. The closest I can remember is Russell Wilson. His last year when he was at Wisconsin did some really similar things, and that's the closest comp I've got in the college game. It's a different throwing style than Mac Jones, and this is kind of going back to the size thing, but Tua, like Kyler Murray, generates a lot of torque with his lower body. If you watch him throw, you know, I think most people are aware of this that have played the sport, but if you're not, you don't really throw with your arm. You throw with your body, or at least you ideally do. And like a baseball player, Tua, who's a little bit shorter but is pretty stout and is a good athlete, can just get torque on his hips and fling that ball out. And if you can do that, like with Kyler Murray or like with a baseball player, you can have an extremely fast, quick release because you can flip your hips and get that ball out a lot faster than a guy that has to wind up his arm to release. Now, there are some negatives to that too, I will say. The reality of that for Tua is his deep throws tend to be more of a drive than a lob. I don't think it's any less accurate than Mac, but the difference is that the ball doesn't drop to the receiver. It's a lot harder for the receiver to adjust on a line drive. It's harder for the receiver to see, and it doesn't come over coverage as well. And a lot of times it makes Tua look less accurate because the receiver doesn't have quite as much time or ability to adjust. Whereas with Mac Jones, he has a much more traditional throwing motion. And I would say it's average to above average in release, but it is an overhead standard motion. And the ball does drop a lot better with Mac. So in the deep ball, you see it kind of come down to a player. That's all fine and dandy, and it's really good in particularly college where play action's more effective. But like in the NFL game where quick release is vital, pass rushes are very quick, and teams are able and willing, both due to practice and quality of receivers, to run a short passing game that requires a lot of finesse and a lot of execution. Tua is just golden for that. His ability to get the ball out quickly to the right target with accuracy is something that you just don't see very often. And, you know, I think it's funny because he's a totally different player in a lot of respects, but I kind of felt like when he came out, if you could have replaced Tom Brady with him and run that short passing attack that New England likes to run, which is based mostly on timing and accuracy, I felt like he would have been an absolute monster at New England. It's going to be interesting to see what he's like in a more open, traditional scheme. But his ability to quickly, accurately, and with tremendous velocity get the ball out is an almost unique trait for a quarterback.
Yeah, and I think he's in a horrible offensive scheme for his talents right now in Miami, and I don't love the talent that's around him. I think they really need to draft some guys at wide receiver and offensive line to help him out. The thing for me that Tua has that cannot be coached, that I think is his number one best asset, is the ability to throw receivers open. His anticipation combined with accuracy is so impressive to me, and people always notice it on slants and posts, but for me, he gains an offense tons of hidden yardage by being able to hit running backs in stride. And I think that people don't appreciate how hard it is to throw to a running back, especially over pressure, and hit a running back in stride, because they're not all great, catching the ball. And they need to be getting ahead of steam because there's always corners out there, there's always DBs out there that they need to be able to make a move, and then they're gone. And if you have to adjust for a ball for even just a little bit, it can blow up an entire play or be the difference between 13 yards or 3 yards. And Tua finds those hidden yards because he's so great at anticipation. Even against Georgia in the national championship game, his first real game, you could see it on a couple of his touchdown throws that just the anticipation was there. Okay, so for me, I don't, just kind of coming to conclusions on this, I don't think that Mac Jones is necessarily a better quarterback. Like, I don't, he's not going to get drafted. Like, Tua got drafted top 5 with a busted hip. Mac Jones isn't going to get drafted top 5 with 2 good hips. But I still think he's an NFL quarterback. And I think that, I think he could be an elite NFL quarterback if he can sit for a year or two. But in this system, because of a couple of the things that he does in terms of being able to throw the ball away and keeping his eyes up with that vertical footwork to get a little bit more time. I think he's better suited for this offense than Tua. So for me, I think Tua's probably a better quarterback. But I think for this year, for what Alabama needs to win a national championship, I think I would take Mac Jones. What do you think?
This is actually where I might disagree with you a little bit. I do think Mac is a more effective quarterback right now than Tua was this past 2 years. I think it personally has more to do with scheme than it does the quarterbacks. And this goes back to an observation I made coming out of last year. Mac Jones on first down last season had a quarterback rating of 258. I think that was like second or fourth in the country if he had qualified. But on third down, his QB rating was 97, which is bad. It was outside the top 100. And I've mentioned this before the year. That's really unusual. Like compare first down comparisons only between guys, he was top 5 in the country. If you looked only at third downs, he wasn't even the top 100 in the company in the country. What the heck? I mean, guys that are good on first down are generally good on third down. To have that massive disparity in the same player was really unusual, and I think it had to do with the scheme and the difficulty of running Alabama's offense in third down situations last year. When teams didn't know if you were going to run or pass, and they ran that RPO scheme with Loxley, it's really effective. But as I started out with the beginning of this discussion, I think when teams knew that you were in a passing situation, it was extremely hard to run that offense. And they weren't very good or practiced at traditional, as we'll put, maybe passing concepts. They didn't have the sort of switch release stuff they've been doing this year, not as much cleverness. They were incorporating that last season. It wasn't quite there. I mean, they were trying to build on what Tua had already been doing for the past couple of years, and then really bring in some new concepts this junior season. This year, you're seeing a much more standard offense. RPO concepts are still in this offense, but you don't see Alabama run a lot of those same like bang RPO plays to the slot receiver that you saw in the past couple years. They traded it off for more schemed plays where guys are open naturally as a result of the routes they're running and the place that they've set up. If you let Tua sit and throw to open targets game after game, I think he'd annihilate people. And I'm not sure how well he would or wouldn't check things down, but I also think the fact that he's operating an offense that isn't built around the hero throw could have a major impact. So I think both of us agree Tua is the better talent and will probably be the better NFL player, but I also think Tua could be better this year in this system with this team. I think we're always going to wonder this, and at least I will personally, how much of Tua's performance or not performance at Alabama was due to the players around him, how much was the scheme he was in. And I personally think that Tua was in a not great scheme, perhaps a pretty overrated scheme, but he had so much talent himself, and he had such ridiculous receiving talent that the guys made heroic plays and incredible catches and great yard after catch plays, despite the fact that they were in a scheme that really didn't allow them to leverage their talent, especially against elite teams.
It's possible, too, that Mac Jones was just having his first real start being against Auburn on the road with playoffs on the line, and then his second start was against a good Michigan defense. But that's neither here nor there. I do think there's something to that, in that Tua was good enough to elevate himself above the scheme to will them to be an elite offense, but at some point it does break down when you face really good defenses. And we saw this in the Georgia game that Jalen Hurts came in and won. Tua got hurt. He was playing not 100%. He got hurt on like the first or second drive, but he was throwing hero shots, trying to will things to happen that just weren't there. And I do think a lot of that was scheme related. All right, y'all, I think we've kind of covered this as best as we could. There's a lot of unknowns here because it's hypotheticals, but we want you to tell us in the comments, one, is it a ridiculous discussion? Is one so far ahead of the other that we shouldn't even talk about it? Two, let us know who you think the better quarterback is, Mac Jones or Tua, and let us know why. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.